Okay, so it is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. I'm Ken Goldberg from the Center for People and Robots. And I want to thank, in particular, while we have a big crowd here today, Dorsa and Lauren for putting on this series. They've been doing a great job all semester, so thank you, you two, for doing all this great organizing. And I want to thank all the DREAMS faculty, Claire, Rujana, Shankar Sastry, and a number of others who have been involved in supporting that. I could say we probably couldn't think of a better person to end the series on than Eric. And I just want to say, you probably have seen, everybody knows his pedigree, his amazing series of accomplishments and background. I would say he began his career. And he made one very unfortunate decision. He went to Stanford. Then he decided to study decision-making and decision theory to correct this. He spent the next 6 years mastering decision-making. And he also got not only a PhD, but an MD from Stanford.
It's a long story.
So he's a doctor. So if anybody has any ailments afterward, come up and let him know about that. He's done a beautiful work in defining the concept of bounded optimality. He's applied statistical decision theory to many different problems. In fact, I have some of his most recent publications range in topics from search and breast cancer, looking at crowdsourcing. These are also patents, unobtrusive active eye interrogation, information cartography, stochastic privacy, and this is my favorite one, remote pet monitoring system.
Am I on that patent?
Yes, you're on that patent. That's from 2016. Anyway, he's incredibly prolific, and now he's here to talk about a brand new idea, which is really exciting, which is thinking not about the last 100 years, but the next 100 years of AI. Please join me in welcoming Eric Horvitz.
There's some legal issues where if you're involved in someone's mind as having help them with their idea, you have to be on their patent. So I'm not sure whose patent that was, but I'll check that one out. Anyway, I'd like to start by thinking about people's attempt in the past to divine the future. And this was a really interesting set of pictures that Jean-Marc Coté put together in 1899, where he just imagined what long 2000 would be like. And this is an interesting sort of home robotic situation that was being imagined. The same kind of metaphor is being used in thinking about the future of services, how consumers might deal with new efficiencies someday, how large segments like agriculture would change, and even how education might change. And this is like a future conception of Udacity, and there's Sebastian Thrun up there, throwing books into the grinder. That's kind of metaphorically interesting. And yeah, that's right. That's the TA. But what I found interesting is that some of the pictures were quite interesting in terms of the forecast. And this was 1899, before 1903, when the first Wright brothers plane flight occurred. And this looks remarkably like a modern plane. And there was already thinking about, would there be warfare someday that'd be very different? I have to say, this picture is kind of like a modern picture, almost from a distance, of a country boasting about its recent accomplishments in the Middle East. There also was forecast. This is a 1953 Mechanics Illustrated image. Again, reasoning about what communications might be like. Could you keep something in your pocket that you can just dial up somebody and talk to them? And it wasn't clear when this might happen, but these people had these ideas that this would be the future. So the uncertainty, I've always thought in the pace and influences of how things go. We can all think about what's going to happen over the next 100 years and so. I like these two pictures because it tells me the kind of world we might be entering, in fact, even faster, where this is 1903. The kind of flapping canvas is off the ground at windy Kitty Hawk, and just 50 summers later, not only have 707 with really nicely well-designed gas turbines, but you have a whole ecosystem with travel posters to Bermuda and travel agents and tickets and who's going where and so on. And so there's lots of anxieties and expectations. I like this. I found this at a museum. This was a warning or a sign calming people down about this new thing called electric power over hotel room doors. That said, don't look. I mean, I know you're used to gas, but this is electric. It won't interfere with things. Electricity for lighting is in no way harmful to health, nor does it affect the soundness of your sleep. And so people imagine seeing this poster and saying, okay, I feel better now about this electric power thing, when people had gas torches as the standard at the time. So the 100-year study on AI was designed as a kind of an enduring project, and the idea is to anticipate the future. I don't know, we did some research, and I don't know of another self or reflection by a technical wedge of engineering, with the sense that it would be important, but it wasn't clear how it was going to go. And maybe we need to sort of ride along with this very carefully and continue to project forward while looking backward at the same time. The idea of having a long gaze and but also extended memory, so you can actually even check forecasts as you go. And it's called the 100-year study, but it's endowed to go forever. So we say as long as Stanford exists, it's a setup to we budgeted things that way. That makes it kind of exciting to know that this will outlive us if it runs well. And in fact, the last standing committee meeting, we sat and spent time thinking about, okay, it's 2117, and the study has not happened. Let's think of all the ways it could have failed, and let's fix them now and make it robust to the possible fragility that might come to the fore over time. So the charge basically is a longitudinal study on influences of AI advances on people and society, trends, disruptions, and then the idea is to be action-oriented. So, okay, can we formulate assessments, make recommendations, and provide guidance on proactivity? Instead of sitting around and, let's say, for some segments, worrying, let's just keep up thinking about things and keep riding along and reflecting. I loved John Hennessy's quote, because he was one of the big supporters of this crazy idea, when a lot of other folks said this is nutty, just forget about it. And I think, this is a computer, a compiler's guy, systems guy talking about AI. And this is his statement. He believes it will be one of the most profound undertakings in science, and one that will affect every aspect of human life. If you think about it, and as Stuart Russell says, imagine success. Imagine success. What would this be like? How will it affect things? And we know it'll be significant, if not one of the most important things that's happened to humanity over time, given success. And so the idea that John Hennessy said, we feel obliged and qualified, I guess this is like the Stanford hubris showing, to host a conversation about how AI will affect our children and our children's children. So the background roots, I was going to give a quick background on the roots of this and then where it's heading now, and we can maybe have some conversation, because I think I set this talk up to be more conversational as we get into these issues. So when I was AAAI president in 2008 and 9, I actually created a theme. I said the theme of my presidency of AAAI will be AI in the open world. What I meant by that is machine intelligence in actual uses, theories and principles for how a system with limited, bounded memory and reasoning and knowledge could do well, and by having kind of reflection about how limited it was, for example, but still be robust, as well as thinking about societal influences. I also worried about opening up the AI literature, because it was all closed under the AAAI membership, and one of my big successes was AAAI papers are now free and open, and that was a big fight internally, because the leadership of the executive staff thought we would lose all of our members, and we only lost like half of them. But I think it's worth it, because things are going. You can't control things by locking things up and asking for membership fees. I wouldn't say half, but people tell me now that this was a bad idea because people now are not becoming members. They're getting access to all these resources, not being members, and it was a risk we took. So, but one thing I did was I commissioned this Asilomar study. We refer to it as now, but it was this AAAI study. It was a 9-month study. Some of the people are here. It was about 30 folks, and the idea was let's break up this committee into 3 groups and think about long-term AI futures as a set of technical people largely, but we also had some philosophers and economists and so on. We had Milan Tambay run chair this potential disruptive advances over the short-term committee. We had a longer-term pace concerns control committee. This was Dave McAllister. Dave is prepared for the singularity in his own version of what's going to happen soon. He really is not just doesn't just believe in it, he works towards it and to understand it better. I said, what better person to chair a technical committee than Dave McAllister? Dave Waltz looked at ethical and legal challenges, working with Edwina Risland, who did legal work. And then, so just what were the findings? So I just read in brief, and there's a set of slides on the website, but in brief, we looked at technical surprises. The first talks at the Asilomar Day on Saturday, I asked Andrew Ng and Tom Dean, both of the two, I said, reflect about things that might surprise us in capabilities over the next decade. They both gave deep learning talks, although it wasn't called deep learning yet, and the deep learning pop occurred that summer in 2009 in July or so, when Jeff Hinton and his team came to MSR with a couple of, looking at speech data. Criminal AI, I hadn't heard that phrase before. I knew what malware was and cybersecurity, but hadn't thought about if you had a red team building a cross-device, really smart, advanced, persistent threat that would live across your devices for 36 months, what would that be like? Should we build something like this? I had no idea that during this, almost the exact timing of this discussion, Stuxnet was being built. I wouldn't call Stuxnet, AI or deeply intelligent, but it was a system that was built purportedly by the Israelis and the U.S. some agency that jumped onto a centrifuge machine, understood the machine it was on, and listened to the RPM, and speed it up and break a whole field of machines all at once, or in close time proximity to one another. Human-machine collaboration was called out as being critical. And then longer term, I found it's very interesting that there were quite a few differences of opinion among technical folks in the mature AI community, I'll call it that, versus the more wide-ranging and free-thinking Singularity Institute people about the possible loss of control of superintelligence. And that's a topic I want to come back to today and talk more about. But they brought up the idea that we need to study classification, understand robustness, control behavior. Might there be research guidelines someday? There were quiet walks on the beach at Asilomar about what would it mean and when would it be appropriate. Talk about containment and ways to do things in machines in clean rooms that were off the net because of concerns of various kinds. And then legal and ethical, back down to earth again. Liability issues, various kinds of common law, tort law systems. How do we represent preferences? What does it mean to have an ethical decision that's autonomous? And then even psychosocial issues with human-like experience in our grandchildren's midst. What does it mean about our sense of self? What myths do we work with? I have a little section of slides talking about why in Japan people are sort of looking forward to AI systems and why we hear about concerns in Western society. And I think it gets back to some basic archetypes, including expectations and myths and what spirits are in these various cultures, and some interesting work going on in that space. All these are interesting research areas. So in general, it seemed like a valuable thing to do. That was 6 years ago. And there would be value in repeating the exercise. So the other finding was that it's pretty clear that, and maybe this was just almost too late doing this kind of study, that the AI community, the CS community, engineering community, needed to basically pay attention to rising concerns in society and what various people were saying about the technologies we were building and their promise and their potential anxieties and worries about that. And as I said before, inwardly there was different opinions. Outwardly, we learned a little bit about communication with media and the public. It requires care. And I like putting this picture up here because we didn't expect this to be a front-page story above the fold in the New York Times, but literally all hell broke loose when John Markoff wrote this semi-dark version of the meeting. I think he implied it was a closed, secret meeting. The implication that look how it starts off. Of course, people write these things they write them in ways to get attention, and also it wasn't totally off, but it was just written in had a lens on it that really disturbed people, I think. Linked to the Asilomar, recombinant DNA meeting and so on. Anyway, so we learned a little bit about that. I don't think we learned enough given what's going on in the press the last 2 years or 3 years. But anyway, so you can go to the website for the 100-year study. The way it's structured is as a standing committee. There's always going to be a standing committee, always standing, always there forever with rotation and robustness. This is the current one. To start with, Russ is the faculty director. We needed a link to Stanford. I'm ex officio because both Russ and I are ex officio on the committee right now. We wanted to start out with a small committee. Deirdre from down next building over is here, is part of the project. She's been very, very useful and valuable to have on the committee. The way it works is we view Asilomar as the 0th study. Taking that pedigree, there's a standing committee. And the idea is that every 5 years, right now is the current way we doubt it, there's a study panel stood up with co-chairs or chairs. And then the standing committee continues between the various studies over time. And then we have the idea of like, there's money for projects and new directions out of band with the actual study panels. So the study panel actually, the standing committee writes terms of reference, and then there's a negotiation between the chair and the standing committee as to what the study's going to go deep on. And they publish that within a year of starting, and then it's out to the world. Give you an example of one of these bubbles right now happening. We don't talk about it very much because it's still nascent. But Yoav Shoam had this idea, which is a really good one, that he got steam on the committee, that a great project to fund and stand up to complement and move along with the 100-year study would be an AI index. So AI indices, kind of like you think about the quality of life indices and these various indices in the world right now that are out now that some are done quite well to track notions of trends over in different, for example, in economics. But AI indices have capturing qualitative and quantitative trends. You know, things like measures of intelligence and capabilities across perception and inference learning and decision making. Types of jobs being replaced, for example, by smart systems over time. Really characterizing that economic impact. Looking at notions of perception, even measures of sentiment in different lines of media, journalism, numbers of stories being published, and so on. I should say I have an intern right now, a Michael Bernstein student, Ethan Fast, working with me, if you know Ethan's work. We set to look at taking some of these tools that he's working on. One is to look at sentiment over time and understand measures of transigence, for example, and dogmatism across AI and machine intelligence robotics from 1950 to today. And it's very interesting to look at the patterns we're seeing, just as in part to see if we can actually even inform this kind of thing, what would it mean? But in itself, it's an interesting study right now. As part of our self-reflection, because we typically don't see the culture we're immersed in as we travel along, awash in interests and concerns and anticipation and so on. And the idea is that these reports come out to actually create output for different segments, different constituencies over time. Interestingly, Ed Felton at OSTP at White House is, as you probably have seen, made an announcement. He has 4 workshops and so on. I met with him for an extended breakfast a few weeks back, and I said, wow, it sounds like a little bit like the Asilomar work we did. He goes, yeah, it's not a coincidence. He said, I've looked at those slides very carefully many times, and the structure has been very valuable for us in thinking through this. You would never have expected back then that this was actually making a contribution to, even 5 years later, to how people are structuring their thinking about things. So I put together a framing memo when we first made this grant to Stanford, of just saying it's circa 2014. Here are 18 topics, made to be very readable, like 4 to 8 sentences each, as to what we care about circa 2014. So maybe people look back at this parchment, if you full of hubris. 300 years ago, they'll say, oh yeah, they were interested back in those days in democracy and freedom. They knew that was happening. Or they didn't realize that AI and warfare would be a huge challenge, and so on. The first study panel, as I mentioned here, brief, is chaired by Peter Stone, and just get a sense for who's on the panel. It's kind of an interesting segment of this interesting group, the working group here. Again, these can be broadened and changed over time. We can do multiple studies. This is just the base case we started with. And back to the memo. So I thought we could spend some time. I wanted to, we have like maybe half the time left. You know, we can even pick and choose one of these topics here. They're all very interesting in terms of, but what you'll see are some slides that I put together when I first was proposing the idea of being important to like the Stanford folks. And so, for example, I started by saying, you notice that the first 2 points here are not like dangers or fears. They're like saying, okay, I guess second and third, what are key opportunities for AI in the world that we're just not grabbing and harnessing and moving ahead with? What are the issues with delays of moving interesting systems that could provide such value in the world, but by being slow and not thinking through this, we're costing many lives, for example. And so I just have a few slides that we were talking back in those days. On key opportunities, you can imagine that we ask the question, how can AI methods reduce costs, introduce new efficiencies, save lives, raise the quality of life? What are the AI bottlenecks? And if we solve the technical bottlenecks or the engineering bottlenecks, we would have great societal payoffs. What are the low-hanging fruit? And then why are we not translating technologies? I know if you told me where hospitals would be in 2016 when I was doing AI in medicine in 1985 and 86, I would be completely stunned. We're still about the same place. Anyway, largely in actual real-world systems. And so we want to ask this question, and then I just have a couple of slides I put up on this that the IOM estimated about 100,000 deaths were avoidable in hospitals with the right kind of thinking and cleaning things up and clarity. And then the Journal of Patient Safety said 440,000. That's basically a city the size of Oakland going away every year, quietly, not in a headline, right? And this came out last week, a new article that says, well, somewhere in the middle, it's 230. Well, they said they basically make 251,000 deaths. Like that seems a little bit too precise for me, but they actually went through records. Actually, they go further out in the digits, I think, in terms of their precision. But look where medical error sits in this ring of death. You say, okay, I know a bunch of those. I know a bunch of wedges here that make up a big piece of this. Pieces of this. And I know of AI technologies that when they were fielded in experimental settings, you could see how they would address things like forgetting and what the problems. And I can point people at papers if they're interested in this space. Cars, public health disaster. Not as bad as the quiet deaths losing Oakland every year, but this was the latest figure to a precision. I'd like to get the last person in there in the U.S. in 2014. We sit here quietly, not a headline, but if it's your family, it's a big deal, and it's hit my family twice in big ways. My mother was killed in an auto accident while I was in grad school studying time-critical decision-making. But 90 deaths per day. Here's the cumulative for the U.S. When we started the internal combustion engine usage over here around 1900, and if you accumulate, you get about 3 million deaths. Okay, the next topic we think is really important, and I'm bringing this up because this is important, a critical theme, I think, in this. I know on Claire's team, and I know that Kathy Wu and others work on this idea of, what is the ideal way to, what are technologies that will help this important issue as we move forward with machine-human collaborations in intellectual spaces and physical spaces. And the two examples that I gave when I was proposing this to Stanford, I just said, look at not even AI, but these two cases are just so striking. The China Airlines 006 you can read about, of February 1985, and this shows you a little simulation of what the plane did. But it was a plane on autopilot cruising along from Taipei to Los Angeles, and number 4 engine failed. Not a big deal. It was on autopilot. Autopilot did some sort of complicated adjustment for that engine, whatever it does to optimize, and the plane wasn't exactly holding a great path. It was processing a bit. So at some point in time, I imagine the pilot stretching their arms and saying, turn that thing off, I'll take over. And the different understanding of what the autopilot was doing and what the pilot thought had to be done, including where you had to sort of change aileron flaps and so on to keep stable flight, was enough where there was a loss of situational awareness, and the 747 dove 10,000 feet in 20 seconds, passengers were experienced 5Gs, and it's the only known recorded history where a 747 went supersonic. But it limped back, it righted itself a few thousand feet off the water and limped back to SFO with bent wings that were eventually repaired. So if you're on a China Airlines flight, maybe you're flying on this plane now. Air France, we all know about, is much more recent. The tow tubes were frozen. Autopilot, highly automated Airbus, shut itself off. Pilots were kind of situationally unaware of what, and we ended up with just sort of a poor decision making, and loss of flight. Now, these machines aren't deeply smart; they don't know how to explain themselves deeply. But the idea of putting human cognition in the center, not as frosting of what systems that pass the baton do, is critical. And we don't know how to do this well yet as engineers. And this is going forward; it's going to be more important. So the idea of like having models of human cognition, transparency of state, explanation, and the mastering of coordination of initiatives has to be a top priority issue for us to point out in a 100-year study, for example. I hope the report is going to talk about this, the first report. More effort, more research needed on this. But more generally, there's this idea of how do we master this collaboration between machines and humans. And we've seen some interesting work all across the spectrum of autonomy. I'm a big Tesla autopilot fan, and I can tell you about my experiences with that. It's like driving a horse, I put it, to learn how to use that well. A horse that is not as smart as a horse, because a horse knows not to run into a wall, I think, once in a while, and so on. But still, it's very interesting and powerful, and I really enjoy it. But the idea is we want to think about technologies that let machines and humans work well together, but also supports it. And even there's an AI problem, an AI opportunity with using machine learning and reasoning and decision making to help with the weave. We have designs and then technologies that help with the weave. It's a really important technical research area. We do a bunch of this on our team at Microsoft Research. You can see our papers in this space, including learning from large amounts of data how to pass the baton and how to best use people in these larger loops. I have to say, it's not just intellectual spaces, but physical spaces. I love the work by Greg Hager's group and Carol Riley's work, trying to learn to recognize a grammar of surgery. And so the idea basically is you can imagine through a Da Vinci machine, we can actually learn to recognize a pull or an insert or a tightening a suture. And then you can actually take these learnings and imagine a shared experience even for surgery where this is really clunky with some dough here and so on, where there's a manual mode and then a machine taking over and a volley of baton passing. Of course, it can be much more graceful and can be joint as well. But this is like going between machine passing and actual passing of a suture needle back and forth between a surgeon and the machine. Now, just last week, I have to say, just last week, I don't know if people saw this, at Washington, D.C. hospital called the Sheikh Zayed Pediatric Hospital, showing how to do complicated anastomoses, where you put tubes, like you repair an intestine, and you take two parts of an intestine and put them together. And I should have turned my phone off. But you see here, the machine is actually using infrared to actually see tissue segmentation, and it's helping to do really regularized stitching, working in tandem with a surgeon. And this is a big jump from what we saw out of Greg Hager's group, actually repair of actual living but animal tissue here. It gives you a sense for the direction this is going in. AI and ethics. So I came up 2 technical topics into maybe a broader topic here. And please stop me at any point. We can talk about these issues. Maybe this will be more provocative. And I know Stuart's been very active in this space, thinking deeply about these issues. But what issues come to the fore with automation in the open world on autonomy? Of course, I mentioned before, I believe that the primary ethical challenge we face now is not fielding technologies fast enough, worrying about something that we shouldn't be worrying about, and people are dying because we don't field this technology fast enough. But what uses might be considered unethical? In warfare, it's not clear that the international human rights laws would allow a machine to kill somebody automatically. It's not very humane, even if you got the right person, quote unquote, in an adversarial situation in warfare. I always give this example to my family. I mean, in war, you can find your enemy who has a gun on you, and you can say, I'm going to kill you now. But a human being can say, you're just like me. Get out of here, run. A machine could never do that. Maybe someday it could, but I mean, that's not the way it's programmed for sure. And that's the way it might be thinking. Is that humanitarian? There's the idea of, in general, high-stakes decisions with a high-cost function. And then there's the idea of, like, what are the ethics of building things that have human-like qualities in our midst? Someday, will a system on the phone, on the Skype call, or what it might be, say, hey, hang on, I got to tell you first by law, I'm not a human being. Otherwise, you wouldn't know at all. So maybe that's the disclaimer, like the Surgeon General warning on the cigarettes of the future, right? Or instead of getting your call be monitored for quality, you get this disclaimer, and it's really important for ethics and a variety of reasons, for example. AI in high-stakes domain, this is a really important area that people are thinking about right now, especially where you have open world complexity and unforeseen situations. I like to say, well, here we are, we're engineers at Tesla or at Volvo now. A lot of companies are coming up with their platforms, and we engineer our cars to do just perfectly. We think about all the situations we can think about. And then, wait, I didn't think about this idea of a bicycle around a bush, or this kid on roller skates zooming in front of the car, and what does this mean, and how do we work? And so, how do we build systems that do the right thing in unforeseen situations? You can imagine, like, even someday having consequentialist ethics on board versus deontological, where it's just going to cost-benefit balance. I'll figure this out, and I'll use the human preferences of the driver or the manufacturer. There's ideas about how do you teach systems human values, ethical norms, and of course, systems that understand when to turn control over to people would be very nice, because we'll assume people have the final say in these high-stakes areas. If a system was reflective enough to know when to do this, who drives a Tesla with autopilot? Oh, come on. All right. Anyway.
Me too.
Oh, okay. Nerd with anxiety as someone demoed the wheel turning on curving streets to you and so on? Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah, my wife was less excited about it when she got it the first time. Anyway, but if the system, with its own model of competence, believes it's not going to do a good job, a very loud and nasty noise like the Conelrad from the old days in the civil defense days, you have a shouting noise, and your dashboard lights up like this, which just says, I give up, it's all yours. And if you're eating a bowl of oatmeal and relaxing on the highway, it's kind of an experience to grab the wheel again, right? And it's interesting, it looks like they're learning a lot from the many cars on the roads, because it's happening much less these days. But what could you do? So you could say, okay, I want to make sure we have engineering in models of competency so the systems are calibrated to what they can do, if possible. What about if I can't get a person to help in a handoff situation? Should there be critical safe mode designs and deferrals? Like, okay, I can't get the driver's attention, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to pull over, I'm going to go slower and let them know this is happening. And finally, no response from the sleeping driver or the driver who decided that it's okay to go home tipsy because it drives itself now, lower threshold to get in your car. Maybe they're not available. So I've got to basically pull over with flashing lights in a hazard lane that's designed for these purposes, given how prolific the Model 3 Tesla is in 2000, whatever it might be. You can imagine also engineers can minimize uncertainty via co-design of the environment, new kinds of beacons. We had some work at Microsoft Research for blind folks, sight-impaired people, called guide dogs, where we put beacons into airports, for example, and in certain parts of London. And the beacons plus Bluetooth plus reasoning on board gives a really robust experience. Maybe we should not always consider cars as like the AI folks solve all the problems on board this inside the metal box and look at the bigger ecosystem. Sounds like something that Alex's team would be doing. Okay, so and then how do you understand abilities and failures? So I found this picture on Google image search. I was happy I found it because coming back from a hockey game late at night, I was showing off the car to the captain, our last game of the season, zooming along on a quiet 1 o'clock in the morning freeway coming down from Everett. And all of a sudden up front, I see this kind of scene, which you see on the highways a lot, like, I was closing a lane, human being. I looked up with a raised eyebrow. I was talking, but the car is doing all its autopiloting, no accelerator or brake or steering wheel, it's for 30 miles. And I look up and I said, I wonder what the Tesla would do with that. because it seemed anomalous to me. I'm used to kind of getting used to what the Tesla knows and doesn't know, and what it doesn't know. And I said, let's let it go a little bit. So I stopped the conversation. I said, let's let it go a little bit. Stand by. I said, no, it's going to hit these barrels. It's going to hit these barrels head on. So I just took over. The human gets to grab the steering wheel. But the system had no self-knowledge that it couldn't handle the situation going at 70 miles an hour on the freeway. So there's a whole bunch of interesting research. And our team years ago, Kantaro Toyama, I did this paper with him. We found we had 3 different methods for doing pose analysis and identifying a face in a picture. And we noticed that each of these modalities are very independent types of energy drape, a face patch method. Each one would fail in different lighting conditions in different locations of the head. It was kind of like we watched them 3 different things in and out, fading in and out, some doing really wild things. And we created this idea of Bayesian modality fusion, where we had different modalities. And the idea was to say, let's come up with indicator variables that give us, for each of the modalities, special indicators that would tell us and let us learn, if we had a big database of failures, that what the probability of correctness or the actual probability distribution over the inferences would be for each of the methods. And you can tie them all together, so when you run the thing, it's very robust, even though you're losing these things. But if they each are reporting the signal and the error, they have a good, well-calibrated probability distribution over their failure, the grand unification of ground truth at the top here, over time in this case, really does quite well. So we need to do more of this kind of thing. Of course, now with deep learning, this is at Microsoft, we published this recently, we're trying to learn for image captioning, learn rich models of error, so the system knows when the caption is terrible. It's a deep learning problem in itself to learn a really good error model. I'm saying it's an interesting direction for research. Not getting any comments. I'll get comments on this one, because here we are in the middle of the elections. We called out in the framing memo democracy and freedom. And the idea here is that machine learning, inference, and planning, multi-step planning, can be used, can be laser focused to influence people's beliefs. Stuart, you had a phrase you called this when you talked about this a few days ago. You said it was AI for
political AI.
Political AI. I like that. It's like criminal AI. Political AI. Maybe they're the same thing. Anyway, so so the idea basically is that let me tell you the background now. What kind of where I first became very sensitive to this. I was at a conference on the directions in machine learning and inference at Napa, and there was a poster session, and by a poster, like three young men and a woman were standing at attention, and it was a company called Blue Something. And I forgot the name of the company, but they were the spin-out from the team that was working for the Democratic Party, and they were boasting things like, well, it was our experimentation, inference, and decision modeling that got President Obama into office. We figured out how to basically take our limited resources, do the right experimental pipeline, do the right value information computations, and figured out where the money should go. And I asked him, I said, well, it's very interesting. I said, do you work for the Republicans too, now that you're a startup? No, we just do progressive issues. So but I'm sure down the hall, somewhere else in another conference, there's the other color poster. And because it's going to be quite popular, it's going to be very adversarial and so on. But I also said, could you imagine adding a square that said, include in the optimization sleuthiness, undetectability, persuade people and they don't even know it with multi-step over a period of years, for example, or months. And so to me, this is a really powerful area. It's unclear what this will mean in the future, what kind of regulations we might need for disclosure, and so on. But it's interesting to me how this might affect our beliefs and this idea of laser-focused persuasion of new kinds, not just in the wild, but based on a very interesting hierarchical set of experiments on thousands of people before they even get to your cognitive artifice, you yourself. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, back.
This might not have anything to do with AI, right? This issue of basically mass hypnosis has been around, at least in the 20th century, all the time, all over the place, right?
So if you think,
Nazism, communism, it's all.
I agree, but if you think about, and I'll get to communism in a few minutes if we have time, but if you think about what we do as scientists in this building and the building next door, I guess this is also Citrus, so it's more social as well. But the technical side is we optimize. We figure out how to do it better. We don't just want to have a Hitler style, like sort of what may work well that time, but that was all like he flew by the he was just sort of making things up as he went along, and it worked pretty well. But you can imagine optimizing these
I
things.
don't know. Hitler was pretty systematic.
I don't know if he ran Bayesian inference algorithms and collected data, but yes, it was probably
He
systematic.
was optimizing his throughput.
I'm sure we can study what he did nicely and learn something, maybe even for our Bayesian diagnostic programs, given how good he did, given how well he did what he wanted to do, or so we think. But I still think that this is a scary thing, or at least worthy of a conversation and of monitoring over time. AI and warfare, I'm not going to dive, given how late it is right now, because I think this is a topic that is I don't know, Stuart, have you given a talk lately on this with these people?
Yeah, I gave one to Citrus.
Yeah, so you guys are all experts in this. I'll just make a comment here that even for this maybe was something that Stuart didn't cover, maybe even for semi-autonomous systems where the current directives from the DoD on procurement talk about, it's called DoD Directive 3000.09, requiring to date human in the loop in certain ways. But what is meaningful human control in a time-critical setting? And we already have humans in the loop in weapon systems where we know there were HCI failures that led to deaths, like the Persian Airbus disaster, if people know that story, back in the 80s. Okay, economics. Big topic, big issue. I'm on a National Academy study right now. That'll be out, the report will be out in the fall. What's interesting from my point of view about this particular study is that people like myself are learning a lot from actual economists and people that study labor for decades. So I keep on pointing out like Ruth Milkman from City College of New York, who's written books on what happened to assembly lines in New Jersey and in Detroit when they introduced robotic systems. It's very, very nuanced in terms of the jobs that were created and the jobs that were lost. It's unclear what might happen. All I can say is in this right now on this topic is that we know that when there were big changes with technology, that there were social upheavals and economic concentrations and upheavals as well. That if you study the Luddites of the 19th century, there was a huge reaction to automation of looms and other new automation that hadn't been around before. That it was such a problem that in Britain, machine breaking received the death penalty. And then this is like one of these marches, like we will keep on breaking those frames in the looms until they stop saying they're going to hurt us. But we'll never lay down arms. And you have to ask the question, if you read the Communist Manifesto today, capital, workers, hammers and sickles. What is this all about anyway? What were they thinking? And it's not unclear that if without guidance and foresight, we won't be into a new world of people having these kinds of emotions and new kinds of treatises on what should be done and what kind of revolutions that need to happen and how we should distribute wealth and so on. Just a high-level comment on that. Loss of control. Yeah, go ahead.
One historical point. On my first sabbatical was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Bulgaria invited me to give a lecture series on AI in Bulgaria. How did you turn that down? They claimed that the East Bloc had outlawed AI because it would replace humans. So it took the fall of the Berlin Wall to open it up.
That's interesting. I'll just make a comment that there's this. Maybe we'll stop here, but we see a lot of the fears we see in the press are about the loss of control of AI systems. Might we one day lose control of the intelligence we build? You can imagine different questions that might come up about this, or how could that possibly happen? The people often cite the I.J. Good piece of the system that recursively makes better versions of itself, but without talking about the fact that it's not getting more resources necessarily to expand out with all its brilliance into combinatorial spaces. So you can imagine debates and comments as well as when this may happen. And I have to say that I love this piece here because this was a transcript that I found in a museum, a one-of-a-kind transcript that Alan Turing read on a BBC broadcast in 1951. That's his handwriting, fixing his transcript before the broadcast. But I'm going to pull out, this is Alan Turing of the Turing machine and everything he did, and the Turing Award that's pursued in our field as the Nobel Prize. For it seems possible that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. They would be able to converse with each other to sharpen their wits. At some stage, therefore, this is like Alan Turing broadcasting BBC, we should have to expect the machines to take control in the way that is mentioned in Samuel Butler's Erewhon, which is Nowhere Backwards, which was a 19th century novel about the Darwinian style evolution of intelligences in machines, 19th century, in the time of Darwin, thinking about the way animals were evolving. So I think we have to sort of keep on staying on this topic. And one thing I think is useful to do is backcast, like create a world where machines run everything. And you can't, Forbidden Project style, you can't get out, you're in trouble if you question. And then imagine all the ways that could have happened. And be really creative about it, too. And then once you have some red team, blue team back and forth on this, taking it very seriously, let's get together and say, what are clear ways that we could thwart these high likelihood, or even if they're unlikely, these possible pathways in advance? How will we do that? What do we need to do? And would it really be constraining on delivering the value of AI to the world? And I'll just end by saying that we've seen how statements, as well-intentioned as they might be, can get people so upset and raise this consciousness and concern, maybe even asking the wrong questions in this day and age. And the slide that I want to put up now is how captured for me how much on an edge some people are, and particularly the press. And that was, I had a video that came out last January, actually a year and a half ago, and I said this in the video somewhere. Someone asked me about this, and I made this comment. I was feeling good that day about things. And, I vary my opinion on this. The next morning, this showed up in the press, and my PR people said, "What did you say, Eric? What did you say?" I'm not necessarily a chief, and what's the assumption people have in the popular culture if this is a big news item? It's interesting to think about. Yeah, they read that part of it, right. If you get in my Tesla, you'll see you have a different opinion on that, I guess, right? But and I'll stop by just saying that the other thing we left out today was this idea of the psychology. I wanted to show you this. Two different well-known authors, one in Japan, one in Isaac Asimov, U.S. In Japan, people might be familiar with Astro Boy and these beings, robots that help people out a lot. I grew up with these agents, and I wanted to say that this is interesting culturally. Something that Leiji said, who does anime, that robot has a human heart. He is calm and nonviolent. He protects people. He becomes their shield. And the vision in Japan, he thinks that this is the archetypes, right, come from the traditional reputation of ghosts and other beings. In the Japanese tradition, they are not evil monsters, but beings who have hearts. And this is deep in the soul of Japanese. In the U.S., there's a great piece by reflection by Isaac Asimov on the caves of steel, where he says that mechanical beings are to be found in ancient and medieval myths and legend. It's not surprising that a technological advance, imagine this is the RUR, the play about a robot, that word was first used, imagined in 1921, was seen as resulting in universal disaster, and then Frankenstein. But I like what he said here is that it was pointed out over and over again in these Western stories that there are some things man was not meant to know. Almost sounds like we're summoning the demon, or we hear some of these statements today. And I love the way he sort of ends this here by saying, even as a youngster, he said in his foreword, he could not bring himself to believe that if knowledge presented danger, the solution was ignorance. Always seemed that wisdom was the path. And I love the last phrase here. I'll stop today, maybe we get some more questions here. Fire was dangerous from the start, and so even more so was speech. And both are still dangerous to this day, but human beings would not be human without them. So I'll stop there.
Okay, we do have time for a few questions, and Eric, I'm going to apologize because I have to head home, but I do have one quick question for you to start off. You didn't mention the idea of the AI winter, and I'm just curious what you think about that in this context.
My strong feeling is that, and I just told a media person, speaking of the media, that this time there's enough kindling in the fireplace.
It's different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing that I didn't see on that long list, and I wonder if...
Just 18. We just didn't want to make it too long.
Right. Well, I wonder if this is indeed something that some people are worried about, is the issue of, AI racism, right? And you can see a lot of it
Biases,
in the newspaper, right? The fact that we as the human race are saying things about the machine that in a way is, you can think of as our creation, that we might be kind of embarrassed about, few 100 years down the line, right?
You mean, are you also worried that the guy in the video that was kicking the Boston Dynamics robot and hitting it might be, might be a problem a few years from now when robots look at this carefully and say, what was going on in that video back then in 2000?
I'm not sure that particular.
I know.
Enterprising, but the fact that a lot of this thing assumes somehow that biological beings are somehow better than mechanical ones, and is this an assumption that we should be comfortable with?
I'm just going to leave that a discussion point. I mean, most people that I know believe that we are mechanical machines, so there's no difference. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I was just going to add that it's sort of implicit in the language of calling it artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Already places it at a lower tier than our intelligence.
A lot of people in the field that I've talked to, I was talking to Alan Mackworth about this, actually. He said, he never liked that phrase. How about computational intelligence, which computational also refers to us with high probability. So I see you're right. So and my wife turns out is a vegan, organic, spiritual person who says, I don't like the fact that you study artificial intelligence. So, here, read Herb Simon's book on the science of the artificial. It's different. It means different things. Yeah.
I have to put some clarity into this. I asked the father of AI, John McCarthy. I said, John, I came from Eastern Europe where the same thing, and by the way, AI was not forbidden. I was there, but it was called cybernetics, okay? And, but I had access to the literature as much as anybody else. But I asked John, why did he call artificial intelligence? And he was very honest. He said, Ruzhna, in 1964 or 5, I went to Washington and I needed money. And the government told me, invent a new name. So I did. In foundational way, he tried to discriminate himself or distinguish himself from cybernetics on the ground that cybernetics came from the feedback theory, from control theory, from electrical engineering, systems theory, and plus Wiener with some
Yeah, I heard that
some probability.
Yeah.
So probability wasn't an invention of AI.
So the other comment I've heard about this from John was he just didn't want to keep on fighting with Norbert Wiener. So he's going to have a different kind of field. The other thing is interesting, he said, I think it's interesting, he said, so it probably had many reasons for the name. The other thing he said was he wanted to put the flag on the pole of what he was getting at.
No, but let me just
finish then. Okay.
That he really wanted to say the more conceptual difference that he emphasized about AI versus cybernetics was that the representation, which I really have embraced up to my death, that the representation is not differential equations. He really believed that you carry here logical propositions.
And after all that, we're differentiating in convolutional neural nets now. But the comment there is that if you read the Dartmouth proposal, though, it is so modern. It is so beautifully written in terms of the symbol processing,
but
natural
remember,
language.
Shannon was part of it.
I think Shannon wrote was.
And by the way, and Nathaniel, Rochester. But the idea is
so
probability theory is
there.
quite in there. But they also have different questions they're asking that are very much to the point of how do we build a machine that can learn from its experiences. It was just asking the questions in a different way, I think, as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Claire?
I have a different question. So, we're a university and we do research, and a lot of us are doing research in, decision making in AI and control. And this thought about looking at where the future could be and computing this kind of, the way I interpret it, is this backwards reachable set of the kinds of, where we don't want to be. So figure out, how we could get where we don't want to be and then stay out of that region. It seems so restrictive. When I think, I know you don't believe this, but you don't believe that we should, stop doing things now because of where we could be. But how do we do that? Because we think about techniques and we think about methods, and we think, wouldn't it be cool if we tried this? But those techniques and methods could be taken by somebody who's not a nice person and used in a way that we never anticipated. How are we even supposed to think about that if we don't, if we're not the criminal AI person?
So I didn't want to give answers today. I wanted to stimulate discussion. But my comment is that I don't think I said that except one time in this whole presentation when it came to thinking about identifying pathways to loss of control of intelligence, long-term control of intelligences. There might be some interesting paths there that aren't necessarily research limitations or restrictions, but machinery, mechanisms, and understandings that can be put in place and investments that can be made earlier. Sounds like you'd be a great standing committee person. But by the way, this is the good news if you're looking for service. This thing's going to be around for a long time, so everybody can be part of this.
We need AI pugwash. You
it's
know
very
what
similar.
pugwash?
Oh, of course I know what that is.
Absolutely.
Yes.
What is that?
Pugwash was, I know this from Sherman, my husband.
Who I actually knew as well.
Pardon me?
I knew your husband, right?
Yeah, which is a bunch of physicists after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki really got very conscious and said, we will prevent everything to be used ever again. And they were really, this was in England, they met periodically and they tried to make sure that everybody understands all the consequences. To me, it's a very analogous situation.
Well, it's like
except that
synthetic
this
biology.
is much more distributed.
Right.
But they tried to do this in synthetic biology, right? And that was more recent. That was closer to like 2008 or 2009.
But what is this? Regulate?
Regulate. Try to figure out how to stop people from doing dangerous things with technology.
I think this study, 100-year study, is more around a layer of reflection, looking back and forward, with digital library to track it, to be aware, to call for investment in things that aren't being invested in heavily, to engage new areas. Right now, for example, I can see that the current study, the standing committee is independent from it, but it would be great if they said to the healthcare industry, there's no reason to not be making major strides in in ingesting currently available techniques and then calling out where they'd apply.
Why do you think that, sorry, I'm asking too many questions.
No, it's
but
great.
why do you think that hasn't happened? I mean, you work with these OHSU guys.
You have to, there's all sorts of cultural blocks and bugs. There's all sorts of nuances as to why things don't catch fire until much later than they probably could have. So that's a good question to ask, but we could ask the question in areas where AI machine intelligence more generally and control theory and automation could have huge benefits. And is there a place where people are sitting down periodically, forever, and adults on board asking those questions and saying, this is confusing to me, let's dissect this into all the reasons, and maybe there are good ones in there. Like, oh, it really doesn't work in the real world. Okay, well, let's figure out why. Maybe there's another level of reflection besides funding, grant, and next prototype that a layer of reflection like this could help with. I mean, look, it might not be helpful, but to me, this was my family, my first philanthropy with my wife, and we said, we're going to this is the first wave of it, and let's see how it goes, and we'll put more into this, because we think it's important, but right now it's still uncertain how it's going to go. So far, back to the Wright brothers, we feel like we've got the kind of canvas up in the air on the beach right now. The first cycle's going. People seem to be working well. The standing committee meets. We feel like it's important, and everyone has contributions to make. There are new projects coming out of it. The OSTP wants to sort of do a joint event when the report's ready. So it seems to have a little bit of cachet, some traction with leaders that are looking forward to it. The Stanford folks, the Values Technology Society people, and the ethics people there are linked into it. So why not try it? See what happens.
It's also much broader than physics.
Yeah.
So one thing here is, when I think about these kind of systems and optimization, I think the interesting thing is that the machine intelligences are kind of optimizing, right? Is if you look at sort of systemic things that are failures, the thing that jumps out of my mind right now is a whole bunch of very smart people spent a lot of time thinking about how to, I think it was moving oil or steel onto ships for storage and moving it around, as in Wall Street, financial, because you can make a lot of profit by doing something completely non-productive, had no benefit to society of any kind, but was manipulating basically the commodities markets by moving stuff around. And if you think about, the concept of abuses of that nature and kind of machine, the thing is, there exist points of concentration at which the development of appropriate optimizing technologies will then run away and do stupid things. And so if one wants to sort of avoid the bad implications of this kind of enhanced optimization, enhanced kind of thinking, kind of technology, one has to also look at where would be the exploitation points that you would kind of do crazy things at, and then re-architect systems in such a way that eliminates that point of concentration. And I just wonder, is that something that when I think about vulnerabilities of systems, right? It's kind of a kind of vulnerability that this interconnection of systems that we have in society has certain points that they feel like that they're comparable to cybersecurity threats, but they're different, they're kind of structural.
We'll call them intelligence exploits or something, right?
Yeah. So the question is that an area that our colleagues who think about political economy and so on look for and say, wait, this is a concentration point of some kind which has a lot of power, and as such, the economic incentives will be that if you have some kind of new optimizing technology, we'll try to deploy there and do stupid things.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if those things weren't discovered post hoc?
Yeah.
Right, which most of them probably would be. Think about the financial marketplace. Mike Wellman studies this challenges in the space, and we have flash crashes and all sorts of abuses. And I met the person, the legal scholar who's now president of University of Rochester, who wrote these big regulatory guidelines for automated trading systems, post hoc or omni hoc, continuing on with what's happening. And we have to expect these kinds of things. And wouldn't it be great if we had some effort and attention and eyeballs looking ahead of time for where these hot spots were? think. And so 18 points, it was like, okay, well, what are things that are top of mind? But for all we know, there are the 27 we didn't think of that are more important. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first is, what are things right now that humans do much, I would say maybe more effectively, not necessarily better than AI? And what things down the line will always be something that the humans have to be involved with, such as the value alignment and like that?
It's a really good question. Today, I mean, you can imagine, I just came from a workshop in San Jose associated with Kai on machine intelligence, HCI, and mental health. And there were people thinking about, how do you build systems that could provide psychotherapy more cheaply, less expensively, and really do the job that a great psychotherapist can do. And you see all the literature, actually, the psychotherapy is actually probably more important than medication for certain kinds of mental diseases. It seems like that's a really hard thing. Models of mind of human beings, representing and understanding and working with other minds, human minds, seems to be something that's currently uniquely human. But you can imagine machines getting good at wages of that over time. When we've done some work in that space, like how busy is somebody, what's their intention and goals right now, what's their beliefs. I think that people will always need people in their lives, in the rich social fabric of what it's like to be a human. But you can go on and on. I mean, it's a lot of. I think it's a rich list, and I do think that we'll see teaming more as opposed to automation and autonomy. That will be where people are augmented to achieve their goals. Their capabilities will be augmented by machines and machines that live and work to optimize people's own preferences and desires and objective functions over time. So I think there'll be, hopefully people saw the recent Microsoft proclamation about Microsoft's view on AI. It's all about this, by the way. It was very interesting. And we had a small committee got together, and there was even a Microsoft corporate view. It was expressed about where AI is going and where we want to make investments as a company along these lines. So shall we wrap it up?
Let's thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.